Welcome to the Advance Your Art podcast, where we talk about the journey from artist to entrepreneur and everything in between. You've worked hard to hone your craft. Now take it to the next level with tips, techniques, strategies, and routines used by successful artists to grow their businesses and careers. Now, let's get started and have some fun with your host, Yuri Cataldo.
Hello, Betty. Welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm fine, Yuri. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate being here.
Excellent. So I'd like to start off by having you describe yourself and what you do.
I am a lover of words. I have been all of my life, and so every job I've ever had has had some focus on language in some way. So I've done editing, I've done writing, I've done technical editing, I've done fiction editing. I've written nonfiction. So I just love words, and I'm a writer.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. So you originally studied English literature. What made you want to study English literature?
I went back to get a degree. I wanted to get a bachelor's degree in English because I had applied to be an editor of a children's magazine, and they told me I needed to have either a journalism or an English degree. And so I went back to college and fell in love with literature and never looked back at editing children's magazines ever again. So.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, great. So you also kind of mentioned earlier about your love of words and stories. So, I mean, now you've become a writer since then, but where did that love of, say, words come from, and what ultimately made you want to become a writer?
Well, the love of words came mainly from my dad, because when I was very young and not in school yet, I would go with him. He was a professional photographer, and he would go door to door and take pictures of kids and families and such. And he would take me along, and so he started with word games and, how do you spell that word? What does that word mean? That kind of thing. Then my sisters taught me to read before I started even kindergarten. I was reading. And by the time I was in probably third grade, I was writing short stories. So it's very young that I became a writer.
Yeah. Oh, great. So after you graduated with English literature, you said that you were working as a children's book editor. What was what was that like, and then what did you end up doing after that?
Well, after I got my bachelor's, I was actually freelance writing and editing for corporations. I was never a children's book editor.
Oh, okay. Sorry about
that. That's okay. I mean, I've done a lot of things, but I haven't done that.
Yeah.
And like I said, I did a lot of freelance editing of, oh my goodness, what was it? An insurance, formulary, what is it called that they do, that they have how they decide how much you get paid for insurance. I edited that for somebody, for a company. Mm-hmm. I've edited rocket science. I don't ask me to write rocket science, but I can edit it. So, and I've been doing that. I went back later and got a master's in English while I was working as a full-time tech writer for SAIC in support of the Space Launch System at Marshall Space Flight Center here in Huntsville, Alabama. Mm-hmm. So then I really was editing rocket science.
Yeah, excellent. So tell me what it's like to be an editor. So what goes through that process? I mean, do you have to have an extreme technical knowledge of what the subject matter is, or is it really explaining the written word and grammatically how it's supposed to go?
Well, it depends on what you're editing for. Okay. When I was working at Marshall, what I mainly was looking for was readability, whether or not the reader could follow the logic. I didn't necessarily have to understand all of the ins and outs of what they were. I mean, I've edited the formulas, the actual algebraic formulas that constitute like how they do the guidance systems for the launch system.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have to know what all those symbols mean in order to be able to tell you that there's something missing or it looks like the greater than, less than sign is wrong because it doesn't follow. When I had that happen editing a reliability report where they had flipped the greater than, less than sign, so it said that reliability had to be less than 98%. And I was like, that's not what y'all want. You want greater than 98%. Right. So they were glad I caught that. So I don't have to understand everything about it, but enough to make sure that it makes sense. And if I don't know, then I go ask. I will go ask questions.
Sure. So when you were editing all of these, so like, working for NASA, working for this insurance company, was that, I guess, have you always been an independent editor working with a separate company, or were you also employed by NASA or a couple of these other companies to edit their reports?
I have been freelance editing.
Okay.
I have been employed as an editor for SAIC. And that's pretty much it. I've done, it's one or the other. It's usually not both.
Okay.
I first started at Marshall as a consultant through SAIC. We'll call it that. I was like a temporary employee of SAIC, but then NASA wanted to keep me around, so SAIC made me a full-time employee, okay. And then I was a full-time contractor to Marshall.
Okay.
But I have done editing on the freelance side many times.
Okay, excellent. So also along the way, you've written nonfiction books, you've written a few other types of books, romance novels, etc. So as someone who is an editor and editing these technical pieces of work, what made you want to become a nonfiction writer?
Well, the first thing that happened was that my father-in-law, who was very much into book reviewing and that sort of thing, was approached about writing some not children's, but middle school age books on horses. And he referred them to me to write books on dressage and jumping, mm-hmm. which I did. Those were two of the first nonfiction books that I did. And then subsequent, that was work for hire. So that means that they paid me a certain amount of money and the publisher owns the copyright. So it was, I have that as a credit, but I don't make any further money off of those. That led to another set of books for the middle school age group on how to do hobby clubs. I did hobby clubs and I did foreign language clubs at school and what they would need to do, the kinds of things they could do, that sort of thing. And then all along, though, I was writing fiction. Like I said, when I was in third, fourth grade, I started writing short stories, and I'd written fiction all along. But I'm not a natural-born storyteller. I had to learn the art of storytelling, and it took me a long time because I got sidetracked doing all the nonfiction and the editing and the technical, and that kind of took over my life.
Yeah. Excellent. So let's talk about your very first book. What was your very first book? That you, like your first nonfiction book, and what made you want to write that book first?
The very first book that I wrote is actually a blend of historical fiction and biography. Mm-hmm. And it's a collection of short stories and the biographies of 19 girls from the 1800s who each have a landmark somewhere in our country. And I wanted to tell the story of what they did to earn them that landmark. And so I fictionalized the story, but then I also provided their biography, like where they were born, when they were born, my brothers and sisters, mm-hmm. where you can go find that landmark, that kind of thing. So Hometown Heroines is the title, originally published in 2001, and then re-released in 2012 as Hometown Heroines, True Stories of Bravery, Daring, and Adventure. Mm-hmm. And that book in 2015 won a gold medal from the Children's what is it? Children's Literary Classics organization.
Oh, wonderful.
For Best Young Adult Book. So,
Yeah.
so I'm really proud of that book. Those stories a lot of them are little known, but they're really remarkable girls.
Mm-hmm.
They continue to influence me. When I feel like I'm hitting a wall or I hit a hard spot, I think about one of the girls and the challenges they faced and what they did. And I'm like, okay, well, if they could do that, then I can do this. So,
Yeah. So I'm curious on what that process is like. So you're mixing historical fiction and biographies. So how did you go about, I guess, what was your process for that? So besides the fact that people knew that their names existed and some of the information about them existed, how did you create the backstory that fit your narrative?
Well, in doing the research, a picture of each girl would come to mind as to what kind of situation they were in. If I had ever been in anything similar to that, I would try to imagine how I would have felt, given, the one, Kate Shelley, she wanted to warn the next train because the trestle had washed out, and so she manufactured a lantern and put on her heavy raincoat because it was storming, and she crawled on her hands and knees across another high trestle to get to the next station to warn them, and her lantern blew out, and it's a raging storm, and there's trees rushing down the river beneath her, and I would think, how scary could that be, And then I just tried to convey that in the actual short story that I wrote, the real scene of what she must have faced and confronted, to bring that to life for young readers so that they could maybe identify a little better. It's not just, Kate Shelley went across a bridge and risked her life. This is what she really experienced.
Yeah. Oh, excellent. And then in 2014, you kind of switched a little bit and you started writing romance novels. What made you want to write romance novels, and what's that like?
I wanted to learn how to write romance novels because I had been reading them since I was 13.
Okay.
And I felt like that was something I understood fairly well as to the expectations of the reader for that. And I really thought it would be easy, but I learned really quickly they're not easy to write because there are certain expectations, and yet you want to make a unique and solid story for these people to work their way through a relationship and fall in love. So it was a bigger challenge than some people give it credit, I'll tell you. But, so that, and I like to tell, I believe in the happily ever after. I'm living my own happily ever after, so I believe in that.
Oh, that's wonderful. So your romance novels, they're available on Amazon, and I'm looking at Emily's Vow right now, and it's continuing the historical fiction that you brought up before. So why particularly are you interested in writing historical fiction romance novels?
That one's really easy. I fell in love with historical fiction and historical romances right after my parents took me to Cowpens Battlefield in South Carolina, and I got to walk on the same ground where that huge turning point of a battle happened. And that really brought the history to life, and I wanted to do that for others. And since I wanted to test my mettle on romances, it seemed fitting to do a historical romance series. And while I was studying for my bachelor's degree, I came across an essay written by Mercy, I'm going to get her name wrong, Mercy Otis Warren, I believe. No, I'm sorry, it was not Mercy. It was... If I can think of it, I'll tell you.
Okay.
But there was an essay that was written about the fact that in the late 1700s, there was a common belief among men that if women learned too much, if they were too highly educated, they would become manlike, and it could make their brain sick. Okay. So I wanted to bring that concept and diffuse it in my storyline. So I came up with these three women that each have something to do with creating stories or creating